Christopher Stevens and 3 other officials died when an armed mob attacked the US consulate in the city of Benghazi.
As the Syrian government insists it is open to reform.
Many Libyans are disappointed with the performance of the National Transitional Council.
8.9 magnitude earthquake. Washing away homes, people, anything in its path.
We need the freedom to operate on the ground and in the air. That looks like a second plane.
Events like the Halifax Forum are incredibly valuable by bringing lots of different perspectives together. It allows people to come together.
People can come together.
We are really now sitting at the table with all the actors.
We certainly have the right group of people here to talk through these issues.
Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, Ehud Barak, many who step out of their comfort zone.
A segment of people from both Washington and around the world.
People from all over the world. All countries have experiences to share.
We got the representative Canada.
I'm a Brazilian diplomat.
Well, I come all the way from India for the eternal search for clarity.
People from diverse backgrounds, a remarkably diverse set of people that are normally never in the same room together.
Military to nonprofit.
Those involved in public policy. You have to interact with others, to look at the world through the eyes of the others.
You bring people in different walks of life together to start that discussion.
Building those relationships.
In a totally free environment.
A very friendly setting.
We also do something else in Nova Scotia, and that's lobster.
To work with people and to listen to them.
I think it's really about talking and listening.
Listening, exchanging ideas.
Exchange ideas.
Exchange ideas.
Share ideas.
Share ideas, share experiences, and connect.
In a very, very direct and frank way.
I've never seen such honesty and candor in a public forum.
Candid and frank discussion of the issues.
About what's going on in my country, Syria.
Places like Afghanistan and Pakistan.
It's very difficult to spread democracy throughout the world.
Democracy.
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 The best way to promote democracy is to know each other.
Frankly, every country wants to be a democratic country.
Democracy and human rights.
Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights.
Gender freedom.
Freedom of women.
Freedom means everything to me.
Freedom is a heritage which we need to keep alive.
The forum is key.
It's not just a place where politicians can grandstand, it's a place where they're held to account.
All of us takes a share of his responsibility to achieve international peace.
Peace.
Peace. Peace.
Well, Halifax ends up being quite significant.
I'm happy to be here.
I think that real good can come from this.
Halifax International
Security Forum
Can lead to big things.
Equal opportunity to all.
To connect every human being on this earth.
Are we up to the game?
What we do should be guided by our values.
Halifax is performing a great service for the future of humanity.
More peace and more prosperity to more people than ever before.
And I think we'll be a better world for it.
Mrs. Harper, Minister McKay, Minister Valcourt, honorable senators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Van Prague, and on behalf of my board of directors, all the volunteers who helped put this weekend together, and everyone at Halifax International Security Forum, welcome to Halifax. Many of you have been with us before. Many of you are joining us for the first time. Together, we are building a community at Halifax that understands and agrees that security and foreign policy, like all public policy, is about people. Here at Halifax, all of us are Democrats. And of course, I have to emphasize this with Senator McCain in the room. I mean that with a lowercase d. We believe in government by and for the people that addresses security issues with the best interests of the world's people first and foremost in our minds. But regardless of political party, regardless of what continent we come from, there is a common understanding among us gathered here in Halifax this weekend that the challenges that face us as a democratic community, and they are daunting challenges, will be solved best if they are solved together as a democratic community. It is a truism that applies at all times to say that the world is in flux, but many of us share a profound sense that changes are afoot that will alter perceptions and realities that we have become accustomed to, at least since the end of the Cold War. Our first panel will take a large view and set us up for the weekend, giving us all some perspective of what to expect, what is the new normal. The unfolding, or perhaps never-ending drama of change and turmoil in the Middle East must and will be discussed. The threat of terrorism has not left us. War, conflict, and uncertainty in Afghanistan and Pakistan endure, and new methods of warfare due to advances in technology may overturn traditional thinking about military strategy. The energy that powers the world, both literally and figuratively, is now widely recognized as fundamental to international security. New possibilities for the use of the resources that lie beneath the North American continent could be a game changer. The rising global powers, democratic or otherwise, pose challenges that we must grapple with. How much meaning and how much confusion can be attached to the name of a single country if that country's name is China? And lest we forget, the small matter of the American elections is now behind us. Its meaning and significance for U.S. leadership and global security may not be quite so clear. Perhaps the weekend's panel that best captures the mission that we are pursuing as a community here at Halifax is the question that you, Minister MacKay, will speak to tomorrow morning with Senator McCain. What is our special burden to the world as a democratic community? What does it take to be the good guys? I want to take a moment to recognize and thank the people who make Halifax International Security Forum possible. Thank you, Meg Energy, and specifically CEO Bill McCaffrey, for being the founding private sector partner of the Halifax Canada Club. Thank you to Senator McCain and Senator Udall for again leading the congressional delegation from Washington. Your commitment to Halifax means a great deal to us. And thank you and welcome Senator Mikulski, welcome back, and Senator Barrasso for joining them and us this weekend. Thank you to our media partner, Foreign Affairs, and to editors Gideon Rose and Jonathan Tepperman for your support, your intellectual input, for being here this weekend, and for moderating plenary panels for us. I want to thank NATO, and I want to thank ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, and its leader, Minister Valcourt, for solid support. And I want to thank the Department of National Defense and its leader, Minister Peter MacKay. Our host for the weekend, it's important for everyone to know that Halifax International Security Forum began as Peter MacKay's vision, and with his and the department's support, has now grown to become an independent organization committed to strengthening strategic cooperation around the world. With that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to welcome to the podium Canada's Minister of National Defence, the Honourable Peter MacKay.
Well, thank you, Peter. Good afternoon. Mrs. Harper, our ambassadors, senators, ministers, military dignitaries, colleagues, friends, Kia mala felce, which means 100,000 welcomes to Nova Scotia. C'est avec un immense plaisir que je vous accueille, amis et partenaires, au Forum sur la sécurité internationale au Halifax. Il s'agit déjà de la 4e édition du Forum, qui est désormais considérée comme une manifestation d'envergure internationale grâce à votre participation. It's a huge pleasure for me to welcome you all here, many of you back to Halifax as friends and partners to this incredible Halifax International Security Forum. Me da mucho gusto de estar aquí con usted. That's it for my Spanish portion of my speech. Welcome, all. This is, as Peter pointed out, the 4th edition of our forum, rightfully recognized now as a world-class opportunity to come together and to speak about issues that matter. I look around this expertly designed room, and I see colleagues and counterparts from around the world, friends, people dedicated to the effort of peace, military leaders, academics, many joining us from some of the world's best institutions, all ready to engage in serious and meaningful security discussions. It's no wonder that Atlantic Monthly has called this forum the Davos of international security. In many ways, it makes perfect sense to host an event such as this in the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia. This city is renowned for its history, its port, its centers of academic learning, its cultural creativity, its music, its people, its hospitality. It has always been a place for global gathering, and the kitchen parties here are legendary. It's where migrants to this North American continent came for the first time, having left families, having always found a welcoming opening door to this new continent and a new life. A stone's throw from where we're gathered here, you'll find Pier 21, Canada's National Immigration Museum, where 1 in 5 of our 34 million citizens can trace their family's arrival to this country. During the Second World War, it was a starting point of a lifeline that kept allies supplied as we resisted tyranny and aggression. Thousands of Canadians and our allies boarded ships here in this harbor to join the war effort, some returning to war-torn lands that they left behind. And on September the 11th, 2001, this city is where more than 40 aircraft and 8,000 passengers found welcoming refuge. It's Canada's Atlantic Gateway, one of our country's busiest ports, deep, ice-free, closest to the rest of the world, bringing in more than 500,000 containers to North America every year and sending them to their final destinations swiftly and efficiently. Halifax is home to Canada's East Coast Navy. This is a Navy town, and Halifax is now a global forum for leading security and defense experts, thinkers, commentators from Americas to Asia, the Middle East to Europe and Africa, to exchange experiences and ideas as one community. And this word, this theme, community, is prevalent throughout this weekend. For my friends, hard work and much dedication has brought us here today, and I would be remiss if I didn't, as Peter did, acknowledge a few for thanks, our organizers, volunteers, and dignitaries for their efforts. I want to extend a special welcome, as Peter did, to our colleagues from the Americas, to our distinguished U.S. delegation, led by Senators McCain and Udall, Mikulski and Barrasso. Thank you so much for coming. To Minister Wardak, here with us for the first time from Afghanistan, colleagues and counterparts from across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And to my colleagues who are joining us here from the Government of Canada, Minister of Public Safety Vic Taves, Minister Bernard Valcourt of ACOA, and Associate Minister of National Defence, as well as Chris Alexander, my Parliamentary Secretary. And let me also welcome the members of the Canadian Forces, recently newly appointed Chief of the Defence Staff, General Tom Lawson. General, thank you so much. It's an honor to be working with you and the men and women in uniform that you lead so aptly and represent so well. And let me as well thank the forces far and wide, from all our countries represented here and around the globe. Let me simply say thank you to those of you who wear a uniform and fight for freedom every day. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank Jonathan Tepperman and his team and recognize the invaluable contributions of the premier publication in the field of international relations, foreign affairs, as the official media sponsor of this Halifax Forum. There are numerous others, and so on behalf of Peter Van Praag and myself, we humbly thank you. You are all partners in this community and in this discussion. It seems as though whenever we gather for this forum, we witness transformative events. Our national and international lives seem to change overnight. Last year, we met in the initial rush following the uprisings in the Arab world, where peoples courageously took to the streets in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, to make their demands for respect and democracy heard. Today, we meet against the backdrop of new leadership in China, continued leadership in the United States, terrorist strikes in Israel, and terrorist networks in Sahel, Mali, and Nigeria, growing tension from the Middle East to the South China Sea, and constantly evolving technologies and threats to civilian populations. To that end, we also have great minds bringing attention to the challenges of the day. We'll be drawing on all of that expertise and insights of our U.S. friends to understand the outcome of the American election and its meaning for global politics in the coming years. In China, over the next weeks and months, new leaders will seek to imprint ideas and policies at the helm of a major power and a key player in one of the world's most strategic and dynamic regions. And we continue to bear witness to atrocities across the Middle East and the possibility of even greater atrocities if Iran successfully builds a nuclear bomb. But we also acknowledge the growth and the capability of a 300,000 Afghan security force that is now fighting and preserving the hard-earned stability for what so many and so much have sacrificed. As Minister of National Defense the last 5 years and a year or more at the Department of Foreign Affairs, I've witnessed what can only be described as a world that is unpredictable, often chaotic. To many security challenges that we face, they're multidimensional, they're cross-cutting. We know about so-called non-traditional challenges emerging, like transnational criminal organizations, food and water scarcity, or the spread of new weapons and technology to non-state actors. Many of us in this room have been dealing with one of the worst economic and financial crises in decades. Financial security is also top of mind as we gather. And while we work to make our societies and security establishments agile, resilient, and able to meet these new challenges, there are still old challenges that linger. International terrorism, proliferation of weapons and mass destruction, and the missile systems that deliver them. The proliferation of even more lethal conventional weapons. And the bottom line is that there is a complex interplay of events, trends, threats, and challenges, confluences that can create unforeseen outcomes, a widespread volatility that increasingly and interestingly is being characterized as the new normal. And so, as Peter referenced, we have chosen this as the opening theme for the first plenary session, quite deliberately. We want to hear what our panelists and you as participants here think about this so-called new dynamic. That's why the Halifax Forum exists, to provide a forum where we can constructively analyze and debate and learn as a community of thinkers. The fact is, we often struggle with issues too much in isolation. Even as issues cross our borders and solutions must become global, we continue to work in the old vertical and national stovepipes of ministries, headquarters, universities, and newsrooms. This can and should change. And Halifax is about going global, going horizontal, looking at the nexus of the issues and connecting the dots to get a seamless solution. Halifax is about discussions that question old assumptions, help us bring together the challenges that we need to meet head on. And this forum also informs and enables us as a community of ideas for the real world, a community that remains active even after each of us returns to our homes and our routines. This year, I'm very pleased to introduce to you a new initiative that will help us do that, the Halifax Canada Club, a club that builds on what we've achieved and what we hope to discuss further and moves our community forward. Cette année, je suis ravi de vous présenter une nouveauté que nous aidera dans ce sens, le Halifax Canada Club. Je vous invite à vous informer à ce sujet, mais pour l'instant, laissons la place au forum. Je tiens à vous remercier tous de votre participation cette année. And so, my friends, let's kick this forum off. Those of you who were here previously will know. They'll know what we expect: lively, inspiring, challenging, and sometimes forceful exchanges. To newcomers, stand ready to take part in a tremendous experience that is Halifax. And I hope as well you'll find some time to enjoy this beautiful city on this beautiful coast and the surrounding communities. Don't forget that Sunday morning, I'm inviting all of you to join me at a 7 a.m. 5K run on the waterfront. And most of all, I wish you a wonderful Halifax Security Forum experience and have a great stay with us. Thank you. Merci.
We're just going to do a quick scene change up here, and then we'll get started with our first panel. Thanks very much.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
This has been the longest, the most difficult war in American history.
It's kind of bad when you see your friends taken out, wounded, killed.
We believe that peace is at hand.
In June '82, the Peace for Galilee operation was launched.
This afternoon, the Israeli Air Force attacked a variety of targets in Lebanon. It was, however, an attack with major political implications.
We have agreed to eliminate the world's most dangerous weapons.
We shall not fight against each other.
The Cold War days are over.
Our war against terror is only beginning. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil. We don't get fooled again.
Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans died in the attack.
Violence like this is no way to honor religion or faith.
They're watching all over the world right now. The President of the United States has been reelected.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Gideon Rose, and I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs, and it's really a wonderful privilege and honor and pleasure to be here again at the Halifax Forum. Foreign Affairs is in the business of serious discussion by knowledgeable people of important issues, free and frank exchanges on the most important questions out there, and that's actually the same business that Halifax is in. So we're delighted to be a media sponsor, and it really is going to be a fantastic weekend. Let me just cut right to the chase. We have a fantastic panel here and more importantly, a great topic and a wonderful group of all of you as well, and relatively limited time. So let's get right to it. Our panelists here, David Sanger of the New York Times, Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, now a fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. Wolfgang Ischinger, the head of Halifax's older distinguished sibling, the Munich Security Conference. Really have a great group. The point of this session is to do some sort of conceptual big think on the major trends that'll set up some of the other discussions throughout the weekend. The title is, What is the New Normal and When Will It Get Here? And basically, if you think about it, had Halifax existed 15 years ago, and we'd be having this conference, there would have been some kind of underlying consensus about the general trajectory of domestic politics and political economy, some general underlying consensus about the global track. There was a liberalization going on economically and politically. There was an American and Western hegemony, and things seemed to be going into a new future, but with a relatively clear sense of where they were. In the last 15 years, not only has that certainty, both domestically and internationally, gone by the wayside, but there's been a rapid succession of different models, different paradigms. There was the war on terror that followed the globalization paradigm. Then there was the rise of the rest and mutually growing economies across the world in an unprecedented way. Then there was the economic crisis and the financial crisis and the recession, which has thrown lots of things into chaos, domestically and internationally. We see revolutions of democracy in the Middle East, and we see turmoil in the Middle East. Maybe that's actually a constant. The old normal there is the new normal as well. But we're here to discuss these questions. So without further ado, we're going to start out with David, then go to Wolfgang, and then go to Paula with a few opening remarks, and then we'll get into a more general discussion. So David, what is the new normal, and what are your thoughts on the general trajectory that we're heading into?
Well, thanks, Gideon, and it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be back in Halifax. If this is what the new normal is these days, then we're probably going to have to go redefine the concept of normal, because I think there's really been very, very few times that I can recall when the United States was in such flux itself about the degree to which it views itself as responsible for sort of shaping where the world is. And you saw a little bit of this in sort of an undercurrent of the presidential election. This was clearly an election run on the domestic economy, not on our position in the world, or even the shape that the world could take. But you had a candidate in Mitt Romney who very much emphasized the old order argument that the United States always had to be the leader. And you had in President Obama, I think, a candidate or a president who has made clear over the past 4 years that while he believes that there are moments when American interests are vitally challenged, where it has to step in and take the lead, think the bin Laden raid, think the Iranian nuclear program, there are many other issues in which he is perfectly happy to have the rest of the world step up. We saw this in Libya, and we've seen the outcome of this to some degree in Libya. This is part of what in the United States is described as the light footprint strategy, the idea that the U.S. does not have to be fully in to every single issue. So what's the light footprint good at, and what's it not so good at? Well, it's pretty good at getting a terrorist who is hiding away 35 miles from Islamabad, of course, without the knowledge of anybody else in Pakistan. It is fairly good at getting deep down into the Iranian nuclear program using cyber weapons. And I've spent a fair bit of reporting time in the past 2 years on the question of how the United States managed to use its technological advantage to go do that. The drone technology is certainly an example of how the U.S. can try to manage counterterrorism from afar. What's it not good at? It's not very good at shaping futures around the world. And so we have seen in Afghanistan, for example, that the U.S. has pretty well pulled back from the kind of broad promises to rewire societies the way it had promised a decade ago in Afghanistan. And we are now seeing, as the president heads to Asia, the effort by the U.S. to sort of reinvest in a region where it hopes it can shape events but doesn't again have the capacity to get into the wiring. So to your question of what the new normal is, if you ask Americans, the new normal may well be that there's a world of chaos out there that is not always something that the United States is going to turn around and solve. And sometimes that's a bit of a shock to American allies. You know, you ask people in NATO, how did the Libya invasion go? And their first answer is, it went fabulously, let's never do it again. We ran out of ammunition shooting against an enemy that couldn't shoot back, right? And so I think the big issue that we're going to face over the next 4 years of the Obama administration, and you're seeing this play out to some degree even this weekend as you watch what's unfolding in Gaza, as you see the continuing argument over Benghazi, as you see the continuing debate about the degree to which the United States needs to intervene more fully in Syria, is you see a big argument about whether or not the United States needs to be centrally involved in issues in which its interests may not be completely vital. And that's a big change for the world. That may be the new normal.
Okay. Wolfgang, before I turn to you, I realize I forgot something. Halifax is nothing if not cutting edge, and so you are all encouraged to tweet or have your aides tweet whatever insights you may find. The hashtag is #Halifax2012. We are going to have a force multiplier in the social media realm of all the brilliant insights that are here. So Wolfgang, you can be the first one who's actually tweeted.
Gideon, seen from Europe, the new normal that I can see doesn't look so dramatically different from the old normal. It's become popular in Europe to speak of the decline of America, to name just one example. Der Spiegel had a cover story about, the sick superpower. The truth of the matter is, I don't think that there is going to be a decline. The United States will be the one superpower for a long time to come. The other issue that we get all excited about in Europe, and I regret to say also some people here on this side of the Atlantic, is the future of Europe and the EU and the Eurozone. Here again, I don't see much change. I believe those at Wall Street and maybe in the City of London who have decided that they should bet on the departure of Greece from the Eurozone or on the collapse of the Eurozone, I think they will be proven wrong. I bet you the EU will muddle through. In other words, more of the same. Is that good news or is it bad news? I think it's more of the same. It's a mix of opportunities and challenges. And the one thing that I find worrisome, of course, as a European, believing that we will not be able to do in terms of European and global security without a leadership role of the United States, I find it worrisome if this trend becomes stronger that you just described of sort of American self-doubt. I think we want a continued strong transatlantic relationship, also here, more of the same, and we want a self-confident United States that will continue to be capable of leading, and we'll do our best of hopefully, and I'm not making any promises here, carrying a slightly larger share of the burden as we move along.
Paula, so how about it? When we meet the new boss, will it be the same as the old boss?
Well, let me start with, because hearing both David and Wolfgang, first I'd start with the fact of what has changed. And what has changed is we do have a very different international paradigm. You used the term in your introduction that there's international chaos. I think there is a dysfunctionality to the global paradigm and the geopolitical paradigm that we are in. Ironically, when I think back to issues that I dealt with a lot several decades ago and the time of the Cold War, there was a simplicity in a way to it. Now, actually, what we're confronted with is extremely messy. you not only have other actors on the scene, but very significantly, you don't only have governmental and state actors, you have non-state actors. I would say what brings us all together is a desire for stability, at least on the part of most countries. But the challenge is that we're grappling with international terrorism. We're grappling with, as Minister McKay, you referenced, the rise of technology and technologies getting in the hands of those who are using it to manifest their power and using it for destructive purposes. So I start with first, the scene is a very, very messy one. So then we come to the issue of the U.S., and that's what I'd like to focus on. In this, I think I lean more towards Wolfgang's assessment on this. And the reason why is I do think that the debate and the discussion about where the United States fits in this and its purported decline, I think has been exaggerated. We always go through ebbs and flows. And when you look at the history of the United States, there have been many international crises that we've had to deal with. In this case, I think one of the fundamental factors confronting us is the fact that we are grappling with some very serious domestic economic issues. And so that has a direct ramification on our picking and choosing what we do abroad, how we use our resources, and how we go forward effectively. I personally think that the argument about America in decline, I think that Robert Lieber had an excellent book in which he argued in a very compelling way that the United States is a very resilient society, that it always has manifested leadership in grappling with problems and in grappling with opportunities. And it has had its ebbs and flows. But the fact that we're flexible, we're adaptable, these characteristics have really brought us forward, combined with political will. So I go on that side of the ledger, and as to whether this is the new normal, my view is it depends. I think we're going to see how events unfold. I think that the United States does need to step forward and engage prudently and selectively. I think also the United States has economic issues that clearly are front and center for us, and which has a determining influence on our perception of us abroad. But that doesn't mean that that perception is necessarily a reasonable one. In other words, for the long haul. It is what we're confronted with now, but I feel confident that we will be resilient and that we will tackle these issues by the very nature of what we stand for, and we will go forward and still remain a very engaged, a powerful global player.
Let me stay with you guys for 200 and press you on a little bit. One of the things that is changing rapidly as a sort of factor in the environment more generally is technology, obviously. All kinds of technology across the board, primarily information technology, but playing out in various manifestations. And that seems like it's very dramatically reshaping the world, but it can also have effects one way or the other on power resources, traditional kinds and non-traditional kinds. In many respects, although we often highlight the potential, the downside potential for empowered individuals who can go around and cause havoc using new technologies and new dangers and threats, transnational and otherwise. I mean, there's a new Bond film out. Every Bond film for the last 50 years has featured some transnational, non-state actor going around with new technology causing havoc. So I'm not sure how terribly new a threat that is. But also, when you think about the new technologies, they can often seem to reinforce the power of existing orders. If you think of the degree to which the natural gas technological revolution has re-energized the North American energy markets and is fundamentally reshaping global politics towards the traditional powers in the West rather than away from them. When you think about drones, and we talk about the war on terror, and the degree to which technology has allowed a light footprint that's far more effective in many respects, at least at the specific task of getting bad guys without much direct involvement on the ground than anybody would ever have imagined a few years ago. Is the changing technological environment working to overturn established power orders or to reinforce established power orders? And I throw this open to all of you. David.
Well, as you say, this is an ebb and flow and always has been. Just as the American sense of when we want to go intervene and when we want to pull back in a somewhat more isolationist phase goes in, whether you believe it, a 70-year cycle or an 80-year cycle or whatever, the technological flow goes in a much faster cycle. So in the past 10 years, for sure, I think it has reinforced American power. Because as you look at what President Bush was doing in his second term, what President Obama has doubled down on, then tripled down on in his first term, what you see is an exploitation of these technologies to try to replace traditional on-the-ground the kind of wars of attrition that we have traditionally been in. So drones are a great example, as you mentioned, Gideon. You know, there were 48 or 49 drone attacks in Pakistan during the entire Bush administration. By the time President Obama is reinaugurated on January 20th, there probably will have been about 300 in his first term. Cyber was an example of something the United States was worried about defensively, but was only beginning to go into offensively at the very end of the Bush administration. Olympic Games, the program against Iran, was something that actually managed to expand considerably until somebody made a programming error and it got out to the world. Special forces is something that we rely on far more now as a light footprint strategy than we ever did before. But with each one of these, we've also discovered that the return curve of when other powers or non-state actors are going to have the same technology is shorter and shorter. And so, you know, it's only, we see China, Israel, others have drones now. The Iranians have some drones right now. It's going to be a very short time period before we have to deal with the other side of that. We are already dealing with cyber attacks each and every day on our infrastructure, not of the kind used in Olympic Games, but similar types. So the answer to your question is it can reinforce existing power structures, but it can then also empower non-state actors far faster than we get reinforced.
I would say that David's concluding point is a fair one, except coming back to us, I think that we have kept ourselves still in this environment as being extremely competitive. And you reference an area that's a key one for the United States, and that's energy. I mean, the United States is #1 in natural gas. The United States has been working very aggressively in terms of ensuring that it is energy independent. And towards this end, just the other day, the Wall Street Journal highlighted the fact that the United States is now has really grown exponentially in terms of its own oil production. I think we're going to see more of that. That's just a different power base that you were describing, I think, an important range of changes. But another one that's going to matter in terms of the overall geopolitical calculation and our providing a kind of firewall for ourselves, we are doing it in this energy area, and that's because of technologies and diversity in those technologies.
This is one last one for Wolfgang and Paula. You know, a year ago, there was a lot more pessimistic talk about the failure of the Western model, the success of state capitalism in China, and so forth. There seems to be a little bit more optimistic tone. Ironically, despite all the sort of fiscal cliff hoopla, there seems to be a sense that there's at least some kind of sluggish recovery taking place, and that Europe may not be on the brink of breaking up, and that China itself is facing its own economic problems. Is there a sense now that that there is a fairly confident Western model of sort of liberal democratic capitalism or managed capitalism in some kind of respects. We're in Canada, maybe the Canadian model is the future, that allows you to move forward, and then that's basically what the world is trending towards? Or, I mean, you were in charge of spreading democratization, among other things, Paula, and you're at the center of the European experiment, Wolfgang. Are these things going forward? Are people less worried now than they were, even a year or two ago about the progress of the Western model?
Well, I'll just speak to the issue, because you raised it, about democratic values. I'd put it this way. I think that there's a strong commitment to proceed forward in still putting our values forward and sharing it. But I think that the variables and maybe the ways in which it gets done, are varied. There isn't one single model. One thing that has always been constant is the worst way of doing that is taking a model, our model, and just merely transplanting it on the soil of another country. We've never done that. But now there's a heavy emphasis on the importance of working internally in other countries and really working close hand for sustainable long-term results. In other words, groups that are on the ground. We've always done that, but I think that's come even more so to the forefront. What strikes me, and Gideon, this really goes to the heart of what you ask, it's a fact. When you look at where do people come? They come to the United States. I still don't know that there's a high volume going to, say, China.
They come to North America.
Yes. Stand corrected. The point is though, they're not going to, let's take the China model. So I think that's an important distinguishing factor, and I think we need to keep that in mind.
Okay.
I guess I need to ask Senator McCain for permission to quote from memory, obviously, from what he said in Munich last February, which is pertinent because he made an important point. He said, maybe you didn't even use the word maybe, the Arab Spring will come to China, ? I think we should be quite self-confident, not overconfident, but I think we have a sustainable model. I'm much less certain that China has, at this point, a truly sustainable model. So that's not really my worry from a European point of view. My worry from a European point of view is a different worry. I worry that as we look at these global challenges that Paula mentioned, from terrorism to piracy to proliferation, et cetera, our ability to create and maintain a functioning system of global governance appears to have declined. Our ability to have a working system of global governance. When I look at what's going on with Syria, the United Nations Security Council is dysfunctional, not working, not capable of coming to a conclusion. The G20 has not fulfilled, at least not according to me, the expectations that we had when this larger body was created. In other words, from a European point of view, you need to worry about the fact that as Europe will have obviously a smaller portion of the cake in the future. Germany is going to have 1% of the world's population. The EU altogether 5% maybe by 2040 or so. In other words, we probably need minority protection. We haven't thought about that much. That's a specific problem for Europeans, not so much for Americans. And if that's a correct analysis, then we need to worry about global governance. Are we capable, as long as we are in charge, and as long as we do still represent to some degree the majority, and as long as we're capable of helping to shape the international system? Are we capable of shaping an international system which will be sustained even when we are only a minority? In other words, when others call the shots. Can we reform the UN, the G20 system, and other international institutions, including the World Bank, with an adequate voting system, etc., in a way that the rising powers, when they ask for a greater share of the cake, that they find that acceptable, legitimate, and fair? I think that's a huge task that we should commit ourselves to, but with a sense of confidence. So far, I think there is no reason for us to believe that we've run out of steam.
I feel like I'm back in the U.S. election with my hedge fund buddies talking about the travails of the 1%. Let's broaden the discussion a little and bring in some of our more diverse voices here from different people, different perspectives. Anybody want to enter the conversation? Just raise your hand. I'll call on you. We have people with mics will come by, and you want to stand, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question or make your comment. Any questions from the floor or comments from the floor? Yes, over here.
Thank you. François Géret. I would like to ask you the following question. You have mentioned a number of, let's say, tools, such as cyber weapons, such as drones and special forces. All right. They are not an end in themselves. They are just tools to achieve what? That's the big issue. Olympic Games was a smart move, but it didn't resolve the Iranian problem. Same for other places. So my question is, don't you think that there is some kind of ambiguity trying to use new, smart technology, that kind of stuff, pretending to get solutions, and at the same time, let's say, the old traditional political diplomatic approach doesn't provide solution in the end. So isn't it a signal that we are shifting from real politics and diplomacy and rely on tools as solutions? Thanks.
Yeah. Has the war on terror devolved into a kind of technological containment of the problem rather than any kind of addressing of the more fundamental issues that might have led to the spread and popularity of jihadist thought in the first place?
Well, I certainly think that the light footprint strategy is intended to do exactly what the questioner is suggesting here, which is simply one of containment and put these things off, but to do it without sending in 100,000 troops and spending, $1 trillion along the way. When you think back about the American reaction to 9/11, 9/11 was an attack that probably cost the attackers maybe $500,000. When the New York Times went about trying to do an assessment at the 10-year anniversary of what we spent in total in reaction to 9/11, everything from rebuilding the buildings to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to Homeland Security and so forth, the number we came up with was $3.3 trillion. And as Paula has made the point, this is not a long-term sustainable thing if you want to be investing at home in all of those things that can do much more good and creative work, or even if you want to invest abroad. So the tools that I described, cyber, drones, special forces, are very much a containment strategy. Where I think the United States has run into trouble right now is that in the years immediately after 9/11, we thought we had a rewire society strategy. And we tried them in Afghanistan, and we tried them in Iraq, and we made very little progress. And as Paul has pointed out, we very rarely have made much progress in these efforts to go do these kinds of things. I think the exception might be the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Japan, and they were significant exceptions. And I think right now we are struggling to come up with what that positive agenda is beyond traditional diplomacy, where you frequently feel that your efforts have been frustrated because we have so many different power centers with so many different interests. Wolfgang?
Well, just one footnote to that. I think it would be a huge mistake, a strategic mistake, if we thought that we could actually use these tools to procrastinate and not to deal with the underlying causes, as you say. I think it is. I'll give you one example. I think it is not good that for the last number of years nothing serious has happened on the Arab-Israeli situation. I hope as a European that we can get our act together again. I think Europeans would be eager to help if the re-elected Obama administration wanted to take the lead and kickstart a process that deserves to be called a peace process. We certainly hope that that would happen. With regard to the drone problem, I just want to add that, of course, everybody is now buying drones. Even European armies are buying drones. But interestingly enough, as our collective interest in deploying troops to countries in other parts of the world has declined because of the not so successful experience in over the last decade, it's quite interesting for me, and I hope I'm correct. I cannot recall a moment in recent history where, in the absence of, active U.S. leadership or participation, the Europeans are contemplating drawing up plans right now for a military mission to Mali, with the argument that what's going on in Mali could be, not necessarily, but could develop into something very similar to the kinds of phenomena that forced us into Afghanistan a decade ago. So what I'm trying to say is, even with all the drone technology and other technologies, I don't believe that international developments will allow us the luxury of keeping the boys home. There will be, unfortunately, contingencies that will force us to address the question of, are we defending our security outside our own borders? And the history shows that we needed to do that in the past, and I think we'll have to do it in the future. So that is my argument, that we cannot, in Europe, simply cut defense budgets more and more and more and more without risking essential security interests of our own countries.
I thought the question's an interesting one because looking at our elections, I think there were a number of issues at play. David described certainly the position that has been advanced by the Obama administration and President Obama. During the foreign policy debate, in fact, there was an outright discussion about traditional means of warfare and versus some of the newer versions. And I hesitate saying this, of course, with Senator McCain there because he really jumped in on this, but the short of it is, I do want to say there are strongly held differing viewpoints on this. So starting with your question, David was presenting one view on this, and I think it needs to be said there are differing views. We will also be headed towards the sequestration debate and discussion, which is going to be a very significant one over the issue of our defense budget. But thirdly, you have in this mix is public opinion. And there is in the United States a reluctance, and both candidates at the time know that Americans were not looking to having boots on the ground. But having said that, I think that Wolfgang made two important points, one of which is, let's look at Afghanistan. Right now, there's the discussion about the status of forces agreement and what kind of presence there would still continue to be on the ground. My guess is that I think in the time ahead, I think that this discussion is going to go through several evolutions in terms of what we do with Afghanistan and with the investment that we put in Afghanistan. And the last point I'd just like to make, and that is that Wolfgang also made the point about diplomacy, and I did want to put that in the mix because that was part of your question. These are elements advanced by the Obama administration, but clearly diplomacy is critical, and he gave one example. There are many other examples where you have to have that and have that kind of engagement, which at times it has been said that we haven't had, unfortunately.
I can see the live tweeting has already begun, so let's give him something to tweet about. Let's get a couple of questions or comments in here, over here, and then over here. Yes? A second.
I'm Dan Rundy. I hold a Schreier Chair at CSIS. We've been talking about the new normal, and I think one of the areas for us to think about is the bringing together of diplomacy, development, and defense. That these sectors are coming and being forced to work much more closely together. Certainly, in the case of the Sahel, this is both a defense problem and it's also a development problem. There are weak states, there are food security issues there are health issues there that are drivers of some of the conflict that we're seeing in the Sahel. So could each of you speak to how we do a better job of bringing those different forces together, because you've each touched on them, but if you could, certainly you could talk about it in the context of the Sahel, but also maybe in the broader context of we've been putting off some of the core issues. To some extent, we're using drones and we're using technology to deal with tactical issues, but perhaps we ought to be using development and democracy promotion for some of the broader strategic challenges.
Okay, and over here? Yes, let's get you in too.
Yes, I'm John Manley from Canada. In your assessment of the new normal, I didn't hear any discussion of the impact of very strongly developing fundamental movements in various of the world religions, particularly monotheistic religions, impacting outcomes of democratic elections, as well as perhaps creating a certain amount of instability in terms of governance models that we face. I'd be very interested in the panel's assessment of the impact of fundamentalist religious movements and particularly in the context of what is going to be a new normal.
Okay, let's just get one more in here, just so you can jump in. Hold on one second, we've got a mic here. Or you can just use this.
Robin Shepherd with the Henry Jackson Society Central European Policy Institute and a collaborator with the
Closer.
Robin Shepherd, Henry Jackson Society Central European Policy Institute.
Louder.
Can you hear me?
Okay, here, speaking to my mic.
That would have been too much. Just to frame, I think what's so interesting about this discussion, and I think it's been raised by all three participants, is, if you like, the baseline question. And just putting the question of the new normal in the context of America, American power and leadership on a sort of decadal basis. And I was sort of jotting down, how powerful did America look in 1979? After Vietnam, Iran hostage crisis, not very. How powerful did America look in 1989? Just 10 years later, extremely powerful. How powerful did America look in 1999? It looked essentially invincible. How powerful in 2009 to now? Well, we've settled down, but we don't really know what we've settled down into. And I think it's this sort of baseline question. And I think we forget how quickly the perceptions of the strength of American leadership can be. But I think the one question that arises from that, and what I think is potentially the question about the new normal, is that in all of those previous periods, the perception has been that America has wanted to lead the free world. And I'm not quite so sure whether America really wants to do that anymore. And I wondered what you thought about that.
let's just get some responses to these questions, then we'll get some more.
I can start with the last one. I think that you've picked up quite rightly the question of the degree to which the United States wants to lead, and I would say as a subset of that, wants to spend the resources that it takes to lead. So you hear this doubt in President Obama's own words. Each time that he was going up to give a speech on Afghanistan, a major speech, the West Point speech when they committed the surge, the speech when he pulled back from the surge, again during the presidential debates, he kept saying it's time for nation building at home. What was that tapping into? That was tapping into an emotion that you hear in the electorate, that you see in the polls. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm just reporting it out, that Americans feel as if we are overinvested abroad. Okay. Then you look at the events to which we feel like we are victim in the United States, that things are out of control, there isn't enough American power, and you hear the counterlash to that, which is we need to stay as invested as we were in that golden period you just described between, say, 89 and 99, which was the great unipolar moment. And I think the message that you hear from the Obama administration is that moment isn't coming back again. So you have to pick your fights, and pick your fights according to national interest. And I think what's going to be fascinating as the Mideast plays out, as you saw happen in Libya, where we got into a discussion, a debate between a Republican defense secretary in Robert Gates, who said, there's no American national interest here, and a group of people led by Secretary Clinton, Susan Rice, and others who were making the argument we have a responsibility to protect, and that was the argument for going in. That argument remains unsettled in Washington today, and that's, I think, the doubt that you're picking up on in your question.
I'll make several comments and on the different questions. On working backwards, on yours, I look at it this way. First, the fact is, when you look at globally countries, the United States has had the capability, and even in this period in time, but secondly, it's the United States that has taken the responsibility and stepped forward. I can't point to another country that has been willing to take that responsibility. Having said that, David refers to how we are modifying some of our approaches in dealing with that responsibility in maybe more cost-effective ways. But also, having said that, I would argue that I think there is going to be a big debate over this issue, because there are many different ways of advancing strategic interests. So let me, with that, flip to the first question on the diplomacy, development, and defense. I think many of you may know, and certainly our members of Congress here would get the question from many Americans. They think that there's an extraordinary, sizable amount of foreign aid that we give abroad, when the fact is it's under some 1%. And why I mention this, that investment, and hence the question, that investment is a form of leadership. It is an investment in stabilizing other areas, and it does matter, and it does fit in the diplomatic end as well as the defense end. Defense doesn't have to be only the traditional definition of defense here. Those kinds of investments can make a difference. So I see a synergy here. Just a footnote on your question, I wanted to actually mention something else. You mentioned fundamentalists, but I look at the United States and our particular backyard, and I should say North America, our backyard, and that is what's happening in Venezuela. There you had, at least in the first election of Chavez, I happened to be an election observer with IRI, and that was a free and fair election. And you have a leader who's not fitting in the category that you've just mentioned, but someone who basically has used elections and in non-democratic ways, is elected in, but basically has been undertaking really seriously non-democratic measures internally, which impacts us. That is a very challenging situation to grapple with, in addition to the fundamentalists.
Wolfgang, you want to chime in on any of
Yeah,
these?
just one thought. I mean, from the European point of view, the so-called unipolar moment has led us in NATO, has led the West, has led the United States, in my view, to overemphasize the possible use of the military. I think over this last decade, we have been forced to acknowledge that the application of military force tends to solve, at best, military challenges, but if you are faced with a political problem, you need a political solution, which means more than just the military. I think that appears to me to be a growing consensus in our community, and that leads me to the first question about the gentleman over there asked development and the military. I mean, as a practitioner of diplomacy, I find that the last decade and a half should have taught us one clear lesson. It was not so difficult to get, NATO to go into the Balkans. It was not so difficult at the end of the day to come up with a collective approach to Afghanistan. But each time we went somewhere with our highly organized forces who had the same radio frequency, hopefully, etc., and who could speak English to one another, we found that in the non-military areas, we were very poorly prepared. We didn't find policemen, judges, administrators to help us through the long haul that each time follows the deployment of military forces. You need strategic patience and what's the word? And a sustained effort. I remember when President Clinton said in '95 or so, we will go into Bosnia for 1 year. The German cabinet just decided this week to withdraw our last soldiers from Bosnia. I mean, some people don't even remember why we're there. It's been so long. But it took more than a decade to get even this little problem right, and we actually, to this day, we haven't gotten it right. Bosnia is still not in good shape. There is still a huge civilian effort required, which will need to go on and on and on, I'm sure, for any number of years. There are some experts here in the room who know this much better than I do. So I think that's very important that we understand and draw the consequences from this analysis that militarily we can actually confront most of the challenges that we have had to face. Our problem is to have the political will and the instruments, the tools of development, of non-military nation building, quote unquote, whatever that means in detail, and that's been lacking very often in all of these cases.
Okay, let's take some more comments and questions back here first, over here, and then there, and then there.
Hi, Stephen Flynn from Northeastern University in Boston. On the issue of new normal, I wonder, really picking up on David's point about the price tag post 9/11, is it that we're in part just sort of coming to grips with the hubris that we could prevent all sorts of bad things from happening? This huge investment we've made over 60 years in the post-Second World War era, that we could ideally stop risk. That actually coping with it is what we really need increasingly to do. And maybe just bring it very close to home. We just had this little bashing Mother Nature threw at us in the metro New York area. Price tag around $60 billion for pretty forecastable risk, and involving basic things like when you have tunnels that are only 7 feet above water, and this tidal surge is about going to be 10 feet, it fills up the hole, and you end up with 86 million gallons of water in a tunnel. And that's not hard to predict. and putting safeguards in place to deal with this and recovering is maybe one element of this. So basically the issue is, are we focused too much on trying to prevent all risk instead of managing it better?
Steve once wrote a Foreign Affairs article in which he tried to argue for a Department of Resilience, which is an interesting concept. Yes, back here.
Yes, thank you. Richard Downey from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies in the U.S. David, you mentioned that after the election, Mitt Romney lost, and we keep this strategy of light footprint. And Wolfgang mentioned that Europe would like to see more leadership. The region that I study, the Western Hemisphere, most of the countries would like to see greater involvement of the U.S. Not all, as Paula mentioned, Venezuela is one of those that would not like to see more of that. But I wonder, there are a lot of reasons, as you mentioned, David, the people in the United States aren't ready to take on that role. Economic reasons, Afghanistan, Iraq, we're tired of it. But I wonder if, as the world becomes accustomed to the U.S. taking less of a leadership role, that one day we'll look back and regret that the world is accustomed to the U.S. not leading. I wonder to get your reactions on that. Thank you.
And there was one over here. Yes. Front. Right here.
Thank you. Since Afghanistan was mentioned several times.
Name and affiliation, please. No, name and affiliation.
My name is Amrullah Saleh from Afghanistan. Immediately, I have a small comment and then followed by a question from Paula. Immediately after 9/11, the new normal was to kill and capture Al-Qaeda and Taliban, bring them to justice, deny a space for militant extremism. And it started as a project with light footprint, and it was successful. As the war protracted and escalated, you increased your troops for the hope to push the Taliban into irrelevance and defeat Al-Qaeda. Now we are talking back to light footprint while Taliban are not defeated, Al-Qaeda has become franchised, and Afghanistan does not have a well-functioning government. So my other part of comment is, we as Afghans get contradicting messages from a strategist community of the West. Some of them say we have lost our worth, we are no longer worthy of your attention as massive as it is today. Some of you say there should be a light footprint with technological containment of the problem. And figures were cited here, $3.3 billion. I think bulk of it because of what happened in 9/11. My question, trillion. My question is, in the new normal, what is the role for militant extremism? Is it releasing them from jail and giving them a space and controlling them technologically? Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to tackle any of these?
Well, I can start with the last. If you think that the light footprint strategy is all about containment, then it does raise the question of what are the limits of light footprint. What if we discovered it doesn't do terribly well? It doesn't build justice systems. It doesn't do the kind of global development that Paula was discussing before. It deliberately pulls the United States back from that kind of deep engagement that we thought in the post-Cold War world we were heading into. And frankly, that you might have thought we were heading into just listening to President Obama during the 2008 campaign, where he talked mostly about engagement strategies. You didn't hear a lot of discussion of what we've all been talking about here today. And I think the fact that we have seen the American pullback here is a combination of war weariness, economic troubles in the United States, economic troubles in Europe that have meant that the Europeans have not stepped up to the degree that I think many in the United States hoped it would. And I think a recognition, an evolution by President Obama away from the kind of discussion of nation building that marked the 2008 campaign, to a period where he's basically said nation building is not our mission. And when you make that kind of statement, then it raises the question, how are you going to get beyond the 1% in development and foreign aid that Paula described? There was a proposal in Washington in 2009, early 2010, to combine the development, diplomacy, and defense budgets together and allow an administration, this came up largely between Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton, allow the administration, any administration, to move that money so that your initial instinct would not necessarily be a military solution to every problem. And of course, it ran up immediately against congressional committees that are responsible for certain budgets, but also just a concern about whether or not that would affect the mix in a way many people, I think, in Washington were not comfortable with. And the idea died. Might be time to bring it back.
I'll comment on several of these. On Afghanistan, the point that I would add here is, you think back about the investment we made. You make a point about the commitment of strategy. I think back to the time when I was in the Bush administration and the commitment that was made. One of the questions constantly was the issue of, will you be with us for the long haul? Will you be committed to us? It runs up against, David already mentioned, a sentiment in the United States in terms of the American public at large. But having said that, my own personal view is, and maybe it's not a broader one in the sense of the American public, but that is, I believe that we've made a significant investment. There has to be a thoughtful way forward. So what we invested in terms of blood and treasure on our part does not go for naught. And secondly, we have an investment in terms of stability in the region. It hasn't been mentioned, but Pakistan is also a critical element to this equation. And in terms of our relationship with Pakistan and the challenges that we've had to deal with Pakistan, that goes also to the point of kinds of diplomacy and influence that needs to be wielded. So my view is, I think that there are challenges definitively, but there's the other side of the coin too, and looking at what our servicemen and women did on the ground and a fulfillment of a mission. I wanted to make just a quick comment on the point about not accustomed to the U.S. not leading, and in that, my view is I don't, well, I'm not the one who said that, but I personally don't think that that's what we're going to see. I think that there are countries accustomed to our leading, and it's double-edged. On one hand, there's a perception of the United States, well, do we want their engagement? Do we not want their engagement? But yet at the same time, then when it comes down to certain situations, we're drawn in. And I don't see that changing, quite frankly. I will give a little bit of a different situation. I dealt in the State Department with the issue of human rights. And there were many times the United States was criticized for many human rights situations. But I will tell you, the activism with our Bureau never diminished, even despite some of the egregious situations we were dealing with internationally that I could recall. It was always there. So I would just simply say, I don't see that changing. I really don't. And that was my comment earlier. I don't see other countries stepping forward and willing to take on that responsibility or literally having the capacity or the capability to do it.
Okay, you want to go in some thoughts?
I'd just like to go back to my initial comment that the new normal doesn't look to me too different from the old normal. When I look at what's going on currently in Syria, for example, I am reminded in a really worrisome way of what happened 15, 17 years ago, almost 2 decades ago, in Bosnia. Are we capable of learning from those types of experiences? Are we allowing a situation to deteriorate further and further and further, a religious war that will create more and more and more hatred and an inability of this country to come together again? I am worried that we are not capable, we seem to be not capable at this moment to use the kind of diplomacy that I think would be highly desirable to find a way to bring Russia to work out a deal with us, to find a solution to go forward instead of saying no, 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 and no again. So I think I just want to make that point that that Paula also made. As wonderful as all the modern tools are, the world will not allow us to get away with just tools. We will need to confront these situations, and I think the moment is here where it is overdue, it is extremely urgent to try to find a way that will end the killing in Syria. Not only because it has implications for Israel and other countries in the region, but because it sets, of course, a terribly negative example to other bad guys in this region and elsewhere, who will be encouraged that they can get away with these types of behavior if we don't act. So I think this is a huge challenge that we need to face, and the solution is not a military solution. It's smart diplomacy.
We're going to have to wrap it up pretty soon just to get the conference back on schedule, but let me just take 2 more comments from here and back there just to get them in. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name's Louise Hand. I'm the Australian High Commissioner in Ottawa. I'm afraid I'm standing in for my Defence Secretary, but it's quite fun for me, if not for him. I just wanted to make a point after having had a long period of being a diplomatic practitioner, particularly in my part of the world, Indochina, Asia, Jakarta, to say that the new normal, viewed from our part of the world, has some good news, which I'd just like to throw in as an advertisement. One is that while this has been happening in the rest of the world, China, we know what's happened in China, but Thailand has sufficiently grown to no longer be a recipient of foreign aid. Similarly, Indonesia, which has 240 million peaceful people and 5 religions that coexist and will shortly be the home of the world's largest middle class. India is no longer receiving development assistance. Burma has come out of its own Jurassic Park quite recently. And I just thought that this is the product of people coming out of poverty. Now, once upon a time, not very long ago, people from all of those countries took to the sea in rickety boats to get away. They don't need to anymore. They can send their kids to school, they can go to the movies, they can have different food on the weekend, and this really does save an awful lot of bother for the rest of the world. Now, when we talk about the reduced footprint, that's very relevant to our part of the world because we've got the famous pivot as well. And I think the light touch, the pivot in our part of the world is really quite a rational reaction to what's happened there. So I'd throw that in as, the effects of 20, 30 years solid development work, diplomacy, nation building, governance, judiciaries, working with police forces. So while there are some terrible things happening while I'm standing here, at the same time you've got half a dozen enormous countries no longer recipients of foreign aid, and to which I'd also like to remind you, the world's economic and strategic weight is ineluctably moving towards. Thank you.
You know, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and end on that very happy note to give a little bit of upside to the other discussions of the snafu normal. And with that, you know, we have a great session here this weekend. All the panels that you can see in your program discuss all the topics and more that have been touched on here in much greater detail with people who really specialize in these subjects. So thank you for coming, welcome. And one last little housekeeping note, can all moderators for sessions this weekend please meet outside the hall just afterward briefly for a quick meeting. Thank you all, welcome to Halifax.
Great, that was fun. Paula.
Oops.